Okay, welcome back. So we've learned in panel one about some successful projects, and in our second panel we talked about some of the things that are bringing us together and why we need to take action. So now we're going to talk about what else we think we need to know and what kind of research is out there that should inform our actions, what policies are in place and will be in place in the future, what kind of funding opportunities are available. And these are the panel members that are going to be able to tell us these things, because these people represent folks on the cutting edge of research and policy development related to forest management practices that support local ecosystem services. First here is Dr. Malcolm North, and he's with the United States Forest Service Sierra Nevada Research Center, and has defined profound changes needed in the way that Sierra Nevada forest lands are managed. And his research is actually the research that was referenced in the previous panel by Craig Thomas when he held up that research. That was Dr. North's research that he was talking about.
And others.
And others, yes. So you were the lead researcher. Pam Giacometti is next. She's with the California Board of Forestry, and their mission is to lead California in developing policies and programs that serve the public interest in environmentally, economically, and socially sustainable management of forest and rangelands, and a fire protection system that protects and serves the people of the state. Next we have Dr. Stephen Kafka with UC Davis. The California Biomass Collaborative is led by Dr. Kafka. And the collaborative provides the structure to define and shape the future role of biomass in the state. And finally, among other responsibilities, the California Energy Commission has a unique role in supporting the use of biomass for energy production, maximizing the contributions of bioenergy toward achieving the state's petroleum reduction, climate change, renewable energy, and environmental goals, and establishing California as a market leader in technology innovation, sustainable biomass development, and market development for bio-based products. So we have, and your name is not on my first card, Jim McKinney, representing the Energy Commission. So obviously a very distinguished panel, and this was such an important topic, we had to bring in 4 people instead of just 3. So I'm going to start with you, and it's the same rules apply to this group as the previous group. I'm going to ask each of you an initial question, and please take 3 to 5 minutes to answer, and then we'll open it up for some additional questions. So Dr. North, let's start with you. You've participated in research and scientific studies on many aspects of forest health and fire management. And what does the latest science tell us about the impact on active forest ecology, habitat, and carbon sequestration of doing nothing? In other words, of continuing with business as usual in our Sierra Nevada forests.
Doing nothing is not really an option. California forests, particularly at the mid-elevations, are fire dependent, and it's a question of time as to when they burn. They will inevitably burn. So there is not an option of leaving the forest alone. And furthermore, a lot of the research is suggesting that many of the intricacies in the ecosystem are very dependent on fire. So if you do not have fire burning in the system after a while, some of these things, such as the basics of the ecosystem, the nutrient cycling, the respiration, those processes actually stall. Are held in kind of a suspended state until fire is put back into the system again. So the research is pretty unanimous on the importance of fire, and we know that eventually the system is going to burn anyway. So the question is kind of how do we make use of that knowledge to appropriately treat the forest to be able to reduce the fire intensity and still be able to benefit a lot of the ecological processes that the system is dependent upon. And recently there's been a lot of interest, particularly in the role of carbon, forest carbon, and how forests might be able to offset some of the carbon that's emitted from human or anthropogenic emissions. There's an estimate that roughly forests can sequester or store about 8 to 10% of what humans emit every year, which is actually a pretty substantial amount given the amount that's put into the air. So the question kind of becomes, how can we best use these forests to actually store some of that carbon and be able to do it in a way that's ecologically consistent with providing for wildlife habitat and reducing wildfire and reducing fuels and wildfire intensity in the system as well. Fortunately, I would say we're actually really blessed in that the forests in California are really made to store carbon and store it in a very efficient and secure place, which is the large trees out there. We have trees that are 25, 30 inches in diameter, and if they're released, some of the smaller trees around them are removed, they can pack on carbon at a much faster rate than 50 or 60 of those smaller trees. And they store it in a very stable place, because if you have a wildfire go through those stands, those trees are much less likely to burn up. And so when we go out and we look at the effects of wildfire on carbon dynamics in Sierra forests, if you leave the stands untreated without any fuels reduction, the emissions during the wildfire, the carbon release is huge. As adjacent stands that were treated properly, and properly I mean they actually paid attention to the surface fuels, which is what drives a lot of wildfire intensity, the carbon emissions in those places are much lower and are dramatically offset the kind of carbon that you would have had to lose by cutting a few of the trees and taking it or putting it down the road to the sawmill or up in the air during prescribed fire. So we really have a wonderful opportunity in Sierra Nevada forests to be able to store more carbon and also do it in a way which is very consistent with a lot of the ecological values that we want to be able to maintain, providing habitat for sensitive species, be able to restore the functions of the system, and being able to kind of produce a low density of very large pine trees, which is historically what these forests had and will make them most resilient to climate changes in the future as well.
Ms. Giacometti, what are the Board of Forestry's priorities and goals in the forests of the Sierra related to wildfire threat, climate change, land management strategies, and the beneficial use of biomass? And what actions are being undertaken to define and meet state goals?
Great. Thank you, Joan. The Board of Forestry and Fire Protection is working in many, many different areas as we work to enhance our forests and rangelands to make sure that they're environmentally, economically sustainable. I'll explain a little bit. We've heard in some of the past panels references to CAL FIRE. The Board of Forestry is actually the oversight board for CAL FIRE as well as the regulatory making arm, hopefully reducing some of the regulatory onus. And then CAL FIRE is actually the implementer and the enforcement agency on the ground. And so I think that's critical for folks to kind of understand that difference. How the board functions is we have 4 different policy committees, or 4 different committees essentially, that work to craft the words of the regulatory packages. The 2 that I am on, Jay Francis alluded to, one of them is the Management Committee, and then I'm chair of the Resource Protection Committee. On the Resource Protection Committee, 2 things that we're working on that really kind of come to this topic. One is our statewide fire plan. We're working on the statewide fire plan, and it's going to be our 2010 plan. The last one was actually done in 1996. That's when the last fire plan was published. And I'd like to read you the goal because I think we have heard this from each panel. So the goal of the 2010 fire plan is to make California's natural environment more resilient and the man-made assets more resistant to the occurrence and effects of wildland fire through local, state, federal, and private partnerships. And I think that really wraps up, I think, what I've heard from each panel today. We are trying to have that whole collaborative effort, bring in every stakeholder, essentially, and get to that resiliency because we are going to have fires out in our landscape, so we understand that. Now we need to make sure that we make that natural landscape more resilient. Another thing that we're working on is, well, actually, it has been stalled because of the freeze of bond funding, but we were working on a programmatic environmental impact report for vegetation fuels programs. Underneath CAL FIRE and the Board of Forestry, there are several different ways to do fuels management for private landowners out on the ground. This would have facilitated, or hopefully will eventually, facilitate a statewide programmatic document that people can tier to and utilize to do fuels reduction projects on the ground. But it was funded by Prop $40, so as soon as we get some of those back, we might be able to start going again. Jay Francis alluded to a package that we've been working on in the Management Committee, which is a modified timber harvest plan for fuels hazard reduction. We've been working on this package for about 1.5 years or 2 years. It has met some real challenges. The concept of this package is to allow landowners on a broader landscape level to do fuels reduction projects. The key is balancing the harvest of merchantable timber with making sure that when you leave the project, you've removed those surface and ladder fuels, so you've increased that resiliency in the forest. And so from the environmentalist side, we hear concerns of there's going to be too much merchantable timber removed, and then from the enforcement agency side, we hear that they're really concerned about, well, what does that look like so that we know that they've met the mark, so there's not an enforcement issue. So those are the things we're wrestling with right now. We actually are hopeful to have some modeling work done at our November meeting, which is next week, to be able to kind of get that visual. So, okay, how would this be enforced? So that's another thing that we're working on that hopefully is going to help and maybe reduce some regulatory challenges. Another thing that the Management Committee has responsibility for is to update the demonstration state forest management plans. When most of those plans were done 5 to 10 years ago, they didn't even think about carbon or carbon sequestration or greenhouse gas emissions. And so as we update each of those forest plans, we are making sure that that's a component. And actually, Jim should address this next topic, but the board has convened in partnership with the Resources Agency and the Air Resources Board the Interagency Forestry Working Group, of which Jim is a member. But it is to facilitate and foster a consistent policy for forestry in climate-related activities. So this is a pretty high agency level, departmental, board level discussion of trying to get to some of these key questions. So.
All right, a lot going on.
Thanks.
Yeah. Dr. Kafka, the California Biomass Collaborative was created in 2003 and is intended to serve as a statewide forum to help coordinate biomass development in California. The commercial viability of biomass-related industries is dependent on resolution of challenging technical hurdles, establishment of supportive policies, public education and acceptance. What policies are in place today that address these dependencies, and what do you think these policies need to look like in the future to make these efforts a success?
Thank you. Let me make a few preliminary remarks so that my comments about policy make more sense. The California Biomass Collaborative is funded by the Energy Commission, but it is independent of the Energy Commission. It is a statewide group that is focused on the sustainable development of all forms of biomass. We're particularly talking about forestry biomass today at this meeting. One of the things that the collaborative has done is produce a roadmap for the development and use of biomass in California. You can find all of this on the California Biomass Collaborative website. And in the roadmap, we try to assess the various sources of biomass that might be used for either electricity production or for alternative fuels or various other kinds of energy uses. And by far, the principal or largest amount of potential supply in California as a whole comes from potentially from forest resources in an absolute sense. It doesn't mean that will end up being the major supply for those purposes, but in fact, there is a very large amount of biomass available. The state has a number of laws. California probably has stepped out farther into the area of greenhouse gas regulation and climate change regulation farther than probably any other governmental entity that I can think of. The premier law is probably AB 32, or the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is a very kind of ambitious name, certainly. And it's really unprecedented because it commits each of us as Californians to reducing our personal greenhouse gas production as a function of how we live. it's roughly, or has been roughly around 14 tons per capita per person per year, and by 2050, the law requires that it be down to 1.4, equivalent to 1.4 tons per person per year. And some people have estimated that's less than Americans emitted during the colonial era, when everything was muscle power and wood powered. So it's really unprecedented, and it's an enormous challenge. While these laws have these objectives, to some degree they also restrict the means through regulations that are concerned about criteria pollutants and other important concerns, but which in fact aren't always integrated with these new public outcomes that are desired. Now, forest biomass can be used in a number of ways, as this very knowledgeable audience knows, I'm sure. The most simple thing is to combust it and to generate steam and heat and electricity. It is also possible to take those kinds of carbon sources and anaerobically ferment them into methane gas or biogas. That's a technology that's available and usable. It's more of a midterm technology. The longer term potential is to convert these woody resources and waste materials into some kind of transportation fuels. But those are not, there's no obvious technology for doing that in place now. There's some efforts going on in the southeastern United States, but it remains to be seen how successful those will be. That's a much longer term objective, and it's not clear whether in fact it even will be a desirable use for biomass resources. The scale of the demand for these biomass resources, for fuels and for energy, is very large, even relative to the resource base we have in California. So no one really thinks, to my knowledge, that we should clear-cut all of our forests so we can drive our cars a little farther. The question is, what's a prudent and beneficial use for these kinds of resources? So what policies, apart from the laws that we have that in fact encourage and also discourage biomass use at the same time, what policies might we create or bring to bearing on these issues? Well, I think it's important to raise this term of sustainability that others have raised in previous panels. It's a very difficult word to address, but I'd like to suggest that it has two kind of distinct components. One is a technical sense of, is what we're doing contributing to the long-term productivity of the landscape and to the maintenance of things that we value that are products of the landscape, like clean water, fish and streams, wildlife habitat? And what are the directions of change that are a function of the landscape, of the harvesting and treatment of the landscape processes that we're doing? So it's very important to have baselines and to have, I think, particularly valuable to have monitoring processes built into regulation that allow us to track trends and observe directions of change. So in a sense, to quantify the technical characteristics of the resource use so that we can all talk knowledgeably from the same place. The second, and I think equally important, if not more important, is the need to create a common vision of what a particular landscape should look like. And I think that was raised in the previous panel, and I was very impressed with that comment. If we can agree about what the forest should look like, or the landscape should look like, I think we can work backwards from that to define technology-related processes that make the best use of those carbon sources. And they'll be variable in each landscape because all biomass, in a sense, is local. We'll have locally suitable processes. But we have to have a commitment to that kind of process that makes us, forces us to create a common and acceptable vision that then is robust against perturbation from outside or disruptive influences that might disagree with that vision. So the quality of the process that we go through to identify that vision is key, and it really needs to be an element of policy. That the policy requires that there be the highest possible quality process, or what we might call procedurally rational process, to creating that common vision. And lastly, we have to be very conscious of the permitting and regulatory issues that that essentially we're dragging along with us into a new era Each of the regulations and permit processes that we have that were all designed to protect the landscape in one way, shape, form, or another. And they all were based on good intentions and the best most thoughtful process that could be brought to bear. But cumulatively and collectively, they often now act as barriers to the creation of new kinds of approaches to landscape management and to new methods of using these resources, which we've now decided are also priorities. So we have to somehow work together to rationalize those kinds of the historical regulatory process and permit process with our new objectives. I'm not going to say how to exactly do that. That's in fact a substantial challenge, but I think it has to be acknowledged, and I think that it has to be very much a conscious part of our procedurally rational process.
Mr. McKinnon. Dr. Kafka talked about a couple of uses of biomass, both biomass to liquid fuels and biomass to energy, and both are connected with the very hot topics of California's low-carbon fuel standard and establishing and meeting aggressive renewable portfolio standards. What is the potential to develop all sources of energy that exist in the Sierra Nevada in order to help meet those standards? And what steps should local communities and project proponents take in tapping into the current strong momentum and available funding sources devoted to these efforts?
Okay. A lot of the panelists earlier today have really talked about local communities, local projects, local governance. I want to step back and really put California's fuels market in the global perspective. We are the third largest fuel market in the world, third only to U.S. as a whole and to China. We're the 8th largest economy in the world. We've got 37 million people. We use 20 billion gallons of transportation fuels every year. It's a huge market. If you do some simple math and say 20 billion times 3, which is the retail price for gasoline these days, that's $60 billion a year. So it creates a lot of opportunity and it creates a lot of risk. And we've talked a lot about sustainability, and I'll kind of circle back to that. AB 32, as Steve well articulated, has a very aggressive GHG, or greenhouse gas emissions reduction goals from the transportation sector. So 30% by 2020 and 80% by 2050. That's a huge, huge stretch. And transportation accounts for 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions in California. So again, big numbers. And we are one of the hubs of the world's fuel market. A lot of companies target California for the petroleum product exports. The Energy Commission has been granted funding authority from the legislature. We now administer a $1 billion fund to try to kickstart the market for alternative fuels and vehicle technologies. It's a lot of money, and it's actually hard to disperse that much money in a responsible manner. So we're targeting electricity, biofuels, hydrogen, natural gas, and biogas. We have about $170 million to work with this fiscal year. Let me talk about sustainability some more. Steve's heard my little anecdote, but I'll give it again. It's truly in the eye of the beholder. So World Series are on. There's 3 umpires talking about how you call balls and strikes. So the first one says, well, I call them like they are. The second umpire says, I call them like I see them. Third umpire says, until I make the call, it's nothing. And we, I think, as a regulatory body, charged with applying a sustainability screen to funding decisions of what projects, what alternative fuel projects can we fund, we have a role in defining what exactly is sustainability in the woody biomass sector. And it's a hard, hard issue. So we're working closely with the Interagency Forestry Working Group, with our colleagues at the Air Board, CAL FIRE, Board of Forestry, our research colleagues at UC Davis. It's not a trivial thing. It's truly not. And hopefully we can talk about that more in the discussion. The opportunity for fuels, alternative fuels from the forest woody biomass sector is also large. Let me throw a few more factoids at you. If you assume about 27 million bone-tried tons of forest biomass material, maybe you can get about 2 billion gallons of ethanol fuels a year. So that would be about 10%, again, 20 billion. In context, our in-state production capacity for ethanol from corn is only 250 million gallons right now. And we use about 1 billion gallons a year at the E6, 6% blending level in gasoline as an oxygenate. In my view, the opportunities to make meaningful contributions to reduce greenhouse gases from woody biomass is greater in the transportation sector than the electricity sector because we have a very clean electricity mix. So about 60% is fossil fuel, but most of that is natural gas. We only have 6,000 megawatts of coal power that we use. So incrementally, if you can reduce transportation fuels from 95% fossil fuel based, which is where we are, if you can get a meaningful increment there, that's going to be bigger than what you can get with a relatively clean electricity mix. There's some pretty serious constraints, though, out there right now, and the main one, in my view, is technology. So cellulosic technology is kind of the holy grail for biofuel materials from woody biomass. Companies know how to do that for grasses, for cane, like sugar cane or energy cane as we call it, from waste streams. But getting commercially viable conversion technologies for cellulosic conversion is just not there. It's not commercially viable. Gasification is promising. You can use biogas in heavy-duty vehicles. You can convert it to a transportation fuel, but that adds cost and energy to it. And then sustainability, it's something that's part of our organic legislation for AB 118. We take it seriously. And the fuel markets can change landscapes. So I've visited Southeast Asia, and I've seen what happens when you've got oil palm plantations that just explode on the landscape, and you lose the natural features of the forest there. Same is true in Brazil, and the same is true, or could be true in Africa if that got started. So the environmental community reminds us, that's their job, to be mindful of the strength of economic forces associated with the fuels market in California as we seek to tap these waste streams like woody biomass from thinning and fuels for the fuels market. How am I doing on time?
I think you're, 1 minute.
Upside down. Does that mean I'm... 1 minute left. Okay, thank you. Okay. A couple more things. Maybe we can talk about sustainability more. Economic sustainability. California ethanol industry invested $500 million in 5 state-of-the-art corn ethanol processing plants. All of those have been idle for the last year. So that is a stranded asset. Private capital money is very hard to come by in this economic climate. So as people think about what project makes sense in a given forest locale, in a given community, think hard about how viable is that feedstock over the amount of time it takes to recoup your capital costs for a given bioenergy plant, whether that's on the electricity side or the fuel side. So economic sustainability is really, really important. Carbon sustainability, making sure that, as Malcolm described very ably, that these really are sustainable carbon sinks, and that we don't somehow inadvertently tip the scale to something that becomes a carbon source. And then, of course, all the ecosystem values that are associated with the forests and that are dear to most people in California is a tough issue as well. If you want to kind of say get involved with the Energy Commission, we are in the middle of our investment planning process this year. We hold public workshops. For those people who have good ideas about forest biomass projects, come and talk to us. We do that every day, talk to the energy developers, and we'll see how you can hook into the AB 118 alternative fuel investment program.
All right, thank you. We've had a couple of previous panel members reference the fact that the federal government is a large landowner in the Sierra Nevada. In your view, what action should the federal government take in managing its lands to reduce fire risk, improve forest health, and use the biomass that comes off the land?
Well, I think there's a really large role for the federal government in doing this and actually leading the way, because at least in terms of the Forest Service, they're not solely driven by economics. And one of the problems we have potentially with the bringing carbon into the market, or the determination of what might happen in forests, is that if that becomes the sole driver in terms of what you're trying to do with a forest, it's going to be just as short-sighted as if we were only using the forest for producing board feed or only setting it aside for spotted owls. there has to be, in terms of this issue that keeps on coming up, sustainability, there has to be an ability to make carbon sequestration storage consistent with the other values that the forest can provide as well. And the Forest Service and the U.S. government has a potential to do that in a way in which possibly a private company, if it's really trying to meet economic viability and projections, may not be able to be so driven to be able to balance those different perspectives.
I would agree with Dr. North. I think there's a great opportunity there for that to be the base kickoff for more private investment. As we look at potentially siting maybe plants that are size appropriate for local communities, that can be the base funding, but then it has to work with that economically sustainable and environmentally sustainable work on private lands as well as in the national forest lands. So I think that's a critical component.
Well, it turns out the fact is that the federal government owns more forest land, I think, in California than any other single entity. And so clearly, if we're going to, and the ownership patterns, from what I understand, are not necessarily, it's not all in one place. It's all mixed up with state lands and with private lands. And so if there could be some way to think about integrative management across the forested landscape so that it's not the federal forests are themselves not the sources of catastrophic fire for the other landscapes, or can be better preserved through some kind of integrated fashion, that would be very useful. For instance, I understand that there's been a loss of infrastructure, particularly in the southern Sierra Nevada, particularly accelerated recently again. And part of that is inaccessibility of resources from publicly owned lands. And so it would be very useful for the federal government to be a partner with local counties, communities, with the state of California in thinking holistically and integratively about the management of the entire ecosystem.
I think I would kind of come back to the technology issue and would encourage our federal partners to further encourage either the USDA research capacity or the Department of Energy's research capacity to continuing trying to develop cost-effective cellulosic conversion technologies, because there's a large volume of material that's going to have to come off of federal forests if we're going to meet the fire risk reduction goals. What do you do with that material? If you just burn it, you're not saving any GHGs and you're contributing to particulate matter and NOx emission. If you combust it, you're doing the same thing. Again, if you can turn the corner and find cost-effective cellulosic technologies, then you create a win-win, because you've got an economic use for this huge volume of material that has to come out. And DOE is funding currently 12 cellulosic conversion projects around the country, but none of them, to my knowledge, include woody biomass materials. So there's a gap there.
Thanks, George.
So a couple of you mentioned private landowners. How do we incentivize and motivate them to take action to manage their forests properly, use the biomass, the same things that we'd like the federal government to do? Any thoughts on that?
Well, hopefully we're trying to create some incentive by reducing some of the regulation by, for example, that modified timber harvest plan for fuels hazard reduction. Okay, that's one step in the right direction. If we can get something like that accomplished so that it's an economically viable operation for folks to be able to do the fuels hazard reduction on their lands, on a landscape level, I think that's critical. The sustainability question, it has got to be economically viable. My husband and I are managing lands that have been in my family since 1903. Obviously, we're environmentally sustainable. If we could not remain economically sustainable, we wouldn't be here anymore. There would be something else going on that land. So I think it's really critical to make sure that sustainability question gets to both of those issues, and that we allow private landowners to manage their property appropriately.
And there's also, of course, something that the market eventually has to be able to internalize, which is to reduce a large-scale carbon emission that you would get from wildfire, you're going to have to pay a carbon penalty up front. by thinning the stand, by removing some fuels out of there, or by prescribed burning. And that can be daunting to somebody on the off, and they're basically incurring a cost up front on the chance that eventually the wildfire may burn through the area that they've gone into. But we do know enough to know that the release in that wildfire is tremendous. So there's got to be some incentives created for people to actually incur that carbon emission up front to be able to avoid the big carbon emission that will well happen down the road.
And if I can add to that, Malcolm, there's a real gap between what a biomass generator can pay at the plant, or what a fuels processor might be able to pay at the plant, and what it costs on a per tonnage basis to get the materials out of the forest, sustainably harvested, and transported. And the numbers just don't really make sense in a lot of cases right now. But if you can kind of work in some of the carbon accounting systems that are going to come out through the cap and trade with AB 32 or with a low carbon fuel standard, there's going to be dollars on the table from the petroleum industry as they work to meet their GHG reduction goals on the fuel side. And they're going to have to look to alternative fuels producers to make up their GHG debt. And again, that creates money on the table, more economic incentives to try to bridge that funding gap.
I think it's important to keep in mind a couple of things. One, if you're a landowner and you have trees, or if you're a farmer and you have corn, you want to sell that corn for the highest price you possibly can. That's your natural instinct, and you need to do that to stay in business. If you're a fuel producer, a fuel buyer, you want to buy that fuel for as cheaply as you can. So they're really countervailing pressures, and it raises this issue of economics. We want as much as possible to allow markets to set prices for things, because markets are generally still the most efficient ways of doing that. But we've also, through federal and state policy and through just the operation of how society works, allowed a condition to develop of excess fuel loading and excess fuel accumulation, combined with the condition of the loss of infrastructure to address it. So it seems to me that a prudent policy would be to tackle that issue directly, particularly by identifying the areas where our forest health is most at risk, and applying resources directly to it in a way that's based on an agreed vision of what the outcome of that process should be, which is a key element to sustainability, which is the value and social consensus element of sustainability. But by and large, I think we just have to basically go in and address that. Those fuels will come out. The technologies, there are some technologies for converting them. Jim is actually, what he's really saying in some ways is that there's a premium on transportation fuels from biomass. So that may not, in fact, be the most efficient use of that biomass, but it could be the most economically valuable use, primarily because of the regulations that we've established. So there is technology being developed. There's some on the ground, but it's not commercially developed and viable yet. There will be more as we go forward in the future. I don't know that we have to necessarily wait for the best technology to agree that we have to start working on that reduction of biomass. Use the technologies that we currently have and allow that, once that process gets rolling, for new technologies to come along as they develop organically.
So we've touched on a couple policies and regulatory actions that need to take place. Are there others? Are there changes in policies or changes in regulation that need to take place either at the federal, state, or local levels to make all this happen?
I don't know if I want to talk about changes. I'm not sure I want to do that at this panel. But I will say that historically, the federal definition of renewable biomass, as embodied in the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act, excludes the use of woody biomass materials from federal lands for the alternative fuels industry and fuels markets. We had a very tough series of public and private meetings last year as we were developing our AB 118 regulatory program. Should the Energy Commission adopt that as the definition, the sustainability definition for renewable biomass? We chose not to do that because we did not think it conforms to state objectives, which are reduce fire risk and enhance kind of the ecosystem functions on the state and federal lands in California. But that was a tough set of discussions. And the Air Resources Board and with Waxman-Markey, the federal level, I mean, these are tough ongoing discussions, and there are a lot of very strongly held views around the table.
That's correct. I mean, the current federal policy in law is basically to exclude federal forest biomass as a source for these transportation fuels and perhaps other sources of energy. And there's been a lot of consensus here today that forests have to be better managed, and that a key to their better management may be the economic use of those resources for energy, for various forms of energy production. So we have a disjunct between the kind of consensus that we have among the kind of, if you will, the leadership community in this area and federal policy. And that has to be addressed, I guess, directly with federal folks. There are also, at your very own Energy Commission hearings, you have folks coming up talking about business proposals, but saying, well, we're doing this first in some other state. For instance, Blue Fire Ethanol is moving its cellulosic waste process from Lancaster, California to Mississippi, because they simply, the permitting processes and the time required for that business to hang on while it goes through this very laborious permitting and expensive permitting processes is too great for them to sustain as a private business. Someone said at least a year and longer and $1 million more in California for permit or process. Mm-hmm. There are good reasons, historic reasons, for this regulatory system that we've developed, but nonetheless it represents a significant impediment to being able to make progress now that we've had added new and also valuable objectives that perhaps reframe the whole problem. It has to be addressed.
And that's a tough nut to crack. Yeah. I think you're right on point. I mean, I think all of us realize that, there have been regulations passed that were for good intent, and maybe the time is now for changes to come to those. And we have different scientific information in a lot of cases now that wasn't there when the regulation was initially developed. And so how do we step back and apply some of that science to those regulations and say, these are the facts on the ground, this is how the regulation should be implemented, let's make those changes to lessen that cost and that burden on folks that are trying to do good things and get things done on the ground.
And certainly in California, we could enable a lot more forests to be treated and a lot more fuels reduction to go on if there were a little bit of carbon credit that went into that equation. Many of these places that we need to reduce fuels in, it's just not quite cost effective to be able to cut the wood and get it down the road to the mills, which are often a long ways away. But the differential in cost is not huge, and if there was just a little bit more money in terms of the carbon credit that came into this equation, the acreage and the amount of forests that we could actually start reducing the fuels in would ramp up pretty dramatically.
We've talked with previous panels about the importance of bringing people to the table, diverse interests, maybe some people who have had some concerns about past practice. I'm going to ask you a similar question to what I asked them. How do you get those people to the table, and how do you keep them there once you've got them?
I'll give two different examples. On the state fire plan, what we did is we looked at the breadth of the stakeholders that needed to be involved in that process. And then basically threw a wide net and tried to find who are the best minds out there that can really help us to craft the state fire plan, utilizing representatives from that whole suite of people. And we did that. We actually invited those folks to the table, and they've been working with us on a monthly basis for 8 or 9 months now. And so that's been a very good process. We hope to have the first public draft out, say, in February 2010. So I think that's been a good process, and we're working through that, utilizing that system. For the other example would be the Modified Timber Harvest Plan for Fuels Reduction. Obviously, that's a regulatory process, and so folks on both sides of the aisle are going to come to us. And we do want to keep them at the table, and we do have the continuing debate on how do we find a solution to make sure that we can have a regulatory package that meets these needs and gets some work accomplished on the ground. So we have to keep those folks at the table to find a solution, to put on the solution hat.
I would take, in terms of philosophical view, a step back, but I think this was a process alluded to by Craig in the last panel, is that a few of the deliberations I've been involved with, surprisingly, they work much more effectively if rather than jumping right into going out in the woods and talking about which tree might be cut and which one might not be, to pull back and have people first agree on where they want the forest to go. And it's surprising that even amongst a very diverse collection of stakeholders in a room, you can get 90% agreement of what people envision the forest should be like almost up front. There's a lot of quibbling about finer details, but if you can get everyone agreeing what the forest needs to do in terms of matching or meeting these different demands of ecosystem restoration, carbon credits, provision of wildlife habitat, you can then take people out, show them a stand in the woods, and most of the time that I've been involved with, you'll get everybody to agree on what should be done. But it's kind of the reverse of what I used to think is that you should go out and kick the dirt first. I kind of have come to believe that you first need to make sure that everybody in the room agrees about the concept of where they want to go, and then when you actually go out there and look at the forest, you get an amazing amount of agreement.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, again, let me take a step back. And I think if we keep our eye on the ball for the fuels sector, again, 95% of our fuels, at least in California, are petroleum-based. And you think about the environmental damage and the human misery and the wars and the civilian casualties that we've had in our lifetimes over petroleum. And you think about how can we move away from that? How can we tap our local resource base, in this case forest biomass, woody biomass from thinning operations? Really, what's the best way to do that? And let's be mindful of what we're trying to move away from as we kind of get ensnarled in these debates about, well, what exactly is sustainability? What DBH tree should be left, should be taken out? How much of the ground cover should be taken out or left? I think we can tackle those. But again, let's be mindful of the big picture. And really, I mean, our planet is changing. Climate change is real. I mean, you can see, you listen to the scientists, you look at the Arctic and Antarctic, the changes are happening. So I think it's incumbent on all of us to kind of do our best to really figure out the local issues. And sustainability is, again, not trivial. These are hard discussions. But let's keep the really big the global picture in mind as we have those debates.
I think this is a very, very challenging public policy issue. I don't think the problem that we have is a lack of knowledge. And I'm impressed just even today listening to the discussion from the nice diverse group that you've assembled here in all the panels, how much agreement there is. And also I'm impressed by the quality of the process that lies behind that agreement. People have learned that they do need to talk to each other and come to some kind of consensus. The tricky thing is how can you create sufficient durability of the outcome of that process to provide a sufficiently solid basis to move forward in terms of making investment, making building projects in local areas and having them grow from that kind of basis. How do you keep this process from being disrupted? And it's not an obvious answer in a democracy because you have access to the courts that everyone has, and you have the fact is that our opinions about what we regard as sustainable are not concrete. They're not fixed forever. They change. There was something on public radio today about the catastrophic wildfire of 1910 that created, essentially sustained the creation of the Forest Service. We could have a huge catastrophic fire in the West again, and people's views about what's sustainable will change. But we have to have some basis upon which we move forward. And there is clear consensus that we can't simply leave these forests alone, that dry, seasonally dry western forests must be managed. And it seems to me somehow or other we have to create a way to make that consensus the basis for permitting and investment to move forward, because the energy is embodied in the biomass. It's usable. We can figure out ways to transform it into useful matter. We just have to be able to move forward.
So, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can kind of add into this again. The Energy Commission is very committed to open public processes as we have these discussions, and we did that in our rulemaking for AB 118, and we're doing it now for our investment plans. And I think assuring stakeholders, every stakeholder around the table on this debate, that they have a legitimate place at the table and that we'll listen to their views, bring your science, bring your field data, bring your evidence in, and let's have a public debate. Let's be respectful of each other, but let's bring the best science and points of view to the table. And at least at our agency, again, we put great value in public process, open public dialogue as we have that. So we can guarantee that. We may not all agree on the final answers. Everybody may not get what they thought they would get coming into the door. But again, if we can guarantee a sound and fair public process, I think that takes us a long way.
Mm-hmm. So another repeat question. If you had to offer any advice to people out in the local areas who are thinking about undertaking projects of this kind, what would that be?
Persevere.
Okay.
Hang in there. You know what? And I think, I think Craig kind of got to it. Go and knock on the door of people, bring folks to the table, and persevere through the conversations.
I would reiterate that point because the times I've seen this actually succeed are people who are persistent. They will stay in the room. They'll get past the initial arguments, and they will eventually find a lot of common ground. But people have to put aside the hatchets that they've developed over the years. There have been long and bloody fights over this. There have been many contentions. There's been many times in which timber harvest has been actually done while it's been called fuels treatments. We need to develop the same kind of language. We need to be on the same page about where we want to go. But I think once we get to that point, there's a tremendous ability to get people in agreement on where the forest should go and to be able to provide the biomass that can be used for the transportation sector.
I'd like to just say I think we have to, have maintain a very serious commitment to rationality and to the highest possible quality process. That we have to be constantly conscious of process, that the process is inclusive and procedurally rational. And I am very confident that if the people who are engaged in thinking about and trying to develop these processes have that kind of commitment, that good outcomes will occur. Maybe that's naive, but I really think we've got the energy, and it's the time for that to be successful now.
I guess I'd like to say, come on down to the Energy Commission. Again, we got, it's fun walking around with $20 bills hanging out of your pocket. A lot of new best friends. But more serious, Brent and his group from Placer County have come and talked to us. Very impressive business plan, very impressive sets of field data. Lori Wayburn of Pacific Forest Trust has come to us with a very interesting proposal for sustainable biomass harvesting linked to fuels project. We want to hear more of that. We want to have people kind of tap their creative juices at the local level and come and talk to us, because we learn as we go through that process about what's going on out there, what the pros and cons of different projects are. But again, we have money, and the legislature wants us to get it out the door. So, like I said, come on down.
And I'm going to give you the same opportunity I gave the other panel members. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about that you didn't get a chance to talk about? Anything else you are dying to say? Now's your chance.
Can I ask a question?
Absolutely.
Well, is there you say the fuels side, so transportation fuel has the most opportunity because that's high cost or more lucrative or more costly, whatever, okay? In my local area, in Westwood and in Bernie, there are two biomass electricity producing plants that are currently shut down because they cannot come to agreement on the rate to be paid from PG&E. So here are two facilities in local communities providing jobs, providing clean energy, using the biomass that are shut down. How do we get to that?
That's a hard one, and I don't have an easy answer.
Okay.
I will say that the California Public Utilities Commission has a referee function to play in these kinds of disputes. The utilities have a tough job. Their job is to increase their RPS, their renewables portfolio for electricity production. They're very mindful of cost, and that's a tough balancing act that they do. But I think, again, if you have existing investments in capital assets, you've got a viable feedstock, you meet all your permit conditions, if it makes sense, there ought to be a way for that, for those particular facilities to open their doors again. But without knowing the specifics, that's about as far as I can go.
Okay.
Any other
Thank you.
last words?
Well, the one thing I would say about technology is that there's a tremendous amount of work going on already. Public labs, private companies, people who simply have an entrepreneurial urge and some engineering training and capability. You see it all the time. I'm sure Jim sees a parade of people coming into the Energy Commission with ideas. We do at the Biomass Collaborative as well. There's a constant stream of meetings about new biomass technology. There's a lot of inventiveness there. It's also, I think, in our DNA as a country to be entrepreneurial and inventive, and if we can just find the conditions to allow that to thrive, that there'll be technologies developed that will match the resources in an optimal way.
I guess I would add a theme that keeps on coming up, I think, in all of these discussions has been sustainability. And as has been pointed out, there's no one consistent definition of sustainability, but we do know that if we don't pay attention to both the economics and the ecological side of things, that you're not going to be sustainable. Anytime we try to create monocultures or we focus on one single aspect of a natural system, we usually end up forcing it to crash. As the saying goes, to build on the baseball analogy, nature bats last. And you have to make sure that you've got the ecological health in the system to be able to sustain both sequestering carbon and providing for wildlife habitat, reducing fuels, and providing the economics for the wood to be able to come out of the forest.
All right, well, thank you all. Thank you for the baseball analogies. I know our executive officer, Jim Branham, will appreciate that and probably add a few of his own. And I'm going to turn it back over to Jim, who's going to wrap up and make the transition to our local breakout sessions.